My dad promised me I'd take over his company after 7 years of dedication, but gave it to my brother-in-law instead. Now they want my help after everything fell apart. 2 years ago, my dad retired from his position as CEO of the lab equipment business he had established. For almost 7 years, he had promised me, a 30-year-old male, that I would be the next CEO. But on the day of his retirement party, he announced that my brother-in-law would be the next CEO instead. It came as a huge shock to me because I was the one who had organized that party, and I had absolutely no idea this was going to happen. I clapped along with everyone else at the party when he made that announcement, but later when I confronted him, apparently my brother-in-law, Zach, a 34-year-old male, was more of a son to him than I was, and he thought I was a disappointment. Let me just tell you, Zach had only been involved in the business for about a year at that time, while I had given 7 years of my life to the company. We had known Zach for a long time, since he and my sister, a 33-year-old female, had been together for almost 5 years and married for 2. Back when my dad retired, I had worked with Zach, and he was a good guy from what I had gathered. But I still couldn't come to terms with the fact that my dad thought this guy was more of a son to him than his biological son. When I asked my dad to elaborate on how exactly I had disappointed him, he told me it was a difficult decision for him, but eventually he had to do what was good for the company. He said that someone as mentally weak as I was could never be a good leader, which is why he chose Zach to take his place. By calling me mentally weak, he was referring to the fact that I had been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and I had made the mistake of telling my family about it a couple of months. During dinner with my parents one night, I accidentally dropped a small container of anti-anxiety pills that had been prescribed to me, and I had to explain everything. My mother was understanding, but my father wasn't a believer in the importance of mental health. He thought being tough was the solution for everything. After I told him about my anxiety, he lost faith in me. I want to make it clear that my anxiety never affected the quality of my work. I never allowed it to reach a stage where it would impact my ability to lead a company. I'm sure many people in upper management positions deal with anxiety, and they don't let it interfere with their work. But my dad told me that I disappointed him by making excuses for my weakness and resorting to pills. So, after much deliberation, he decided Zach was the perfect candidate to take over the company instead of me. He told me that if I wanted to leave, I was free to do so. But he couldn't trust me to lead the company like he had, and since I had shown him I wasn't strong enough, it wasn't just what he said, it was also the fact that he had led me to believe I would be the next CEO, even though he had made up his mind long before the retirement party. It was really hurtful. I haven't spoken to my dad since, because he really hurt me. At the end of the day, it was his company, so he could choose whoever he thought was the best fit. If he thought my anxiety would get in the way, I had to respect his choice. But I didn't have to tolerate that kind of disrespect, so I resigned. Within a few weeks, I started working elsewhere. The only person from my family I've kept in touch with is my mother. After my sister found out I was resigning because I was upset my dad made Zach the CEO instead of me, we got into a fight, and we haven't spoken since. For the past 2 years, I haven't spoken to my father, my sister, or Zach. Occasionally, I speak to my mother, and we try to meet once a month. Every time we meet, she tries to convince me to make things right with my father, but I'm just not interested. About a week ago, my mother called me frantic. She told me Zach had been caught up in fraudulent activities, tax fraud, and had been arrested. Now, even my dad was under investigation because of his previous association with the company. It was upsetting, but I didn't know what she expected me to do about it. She wanted me to speak to my father, sort things out with him, and testify for him in court if necessary. I was very clear with my mother and told her I wasn't going to get involved. I didn't want to be caught up in the mess, and I believed it was better to stay out of it. If my dad wanted my help, I wasn't going to be the one to contact him first. My mother accused me of being childish and holding a grudge, saying the family needed to stick together. I told her my decision was final. I wasn't going to reach out to my father. She then called me selfish and heartless for caring only about what happened 2 years ago. That hurt because I felt if she had been in my position, she would have felt the same betrayal I did, and she wouldn't have been able to move on so quickly. Eventually, I told her this was probably karma for what happened in Zach, and my father deserved whatever they were going through. My mother went silent, and after a while she hung up. I felt bad for saying that, so I was going to call her back a couple of hours later. But when I tried, I realized she had blocked me. Update: a few weeks had passed since my father's unexpected apology, and I found myself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, his words had touched me deeply. For the first time, I felt a crack in the wall of resentment I had built between us. But on the other hand, I couldn't just forget the pain, the betrayal, and the isolation I'd felt for 2 years. It wasn't something an apology could erase so easily. During this time, my sister had gone quiet. After our last heated encounter, I hadn't heard from her, and honestly, I wasn't in a rush to reconcile. Her insistence on trying to rope me into their legal mess was a stark reminder of why I needed to protect my own peace. As for my mother, we hadn't spoken since she blocked me after our argument, and her absence left a hollow ache in my chest. But I was resolute. I knew that until they truly understood the pain I had endured, I wasn't going to be the one to reach out. Then, out of the blue one afternoon, my father called me again. His voice was different this time, more somber, less prideful. He told me that the situation with Zach had escalated. The investigation had revealed more fraudulent activities than anyone initially thought. Zach wasn't just involved in tax fraud. He had been siphoning off company funds for years, creating a tangled web of illegal dealings that were slowly coming to light. The news sent a chill down my spine, but I wasn't surprised. It was as if everything I'd suspected about Zach was finally being confirmed. My father, however, was devastated. He told me that he felt like a fool for trusting Zach, for putting him in charge of the company, and for turning his back on me. He said that if he could go back in time, he would have made different choices. He would have trusted me. "I should have believed in you, son," he said quietly over the phone. "I let my own fears and ignorance cloud my judgment, and now I'm paying the price." His words hung in the air for a moment. I didn't know what to say. I was torn between wanting to comfort him and wanting to remind him that this mess was his own making. But I chose the middle ground. I told him that while I appreciated his apology, it didn't change the past. It didn't erase the fact that he had chosen Zach over me. He sighed, and for a moment I thought he might cry. My father, the man who had always been so stern, so unyielding, was now broken, and in a strange way it made me feel uncomfortable. Over the next few days my father began reaching out more frequently, trying to build some semblance of a relationship. He didn't ask for help with the legal issues, nor did he bring up Zach. Instead, he wanted to talk about our family, about old memories from my childhood that I had long buried. It was awkward at first, but slowly I began to let him in little by little. My sister, on the other hand, remained distant. She hadn't forgiven me for refusing to help her husband, and I hadn't forgiven her for her part in defending my father's decision all those years ago. But I heard through my mother, who had unblocked me and cautiously resumed contact, that she was struggling. Zach's arrest had left her in financial ruin. She was trying to navigate the fallout of his actions, but it was clear that her world had been turned upside down. It would have been easy to feel smug, to say "I told you so." Sad for her, for the family we used to be, and for how things had spiraled so far out of control. Then came the next unexpected twist. One evening my father called and told me that my mother wanted to have a family dinner to try and patch things up between all of us. It sounded like a bad idea. We were all too raw, too broken, and too angry. But after some hesitation I agreed to go. The dinner was tense. My mother tried to play peacemaker, but the silence around the table was thick with unresolved issues. My father, to his credit, tried to open the conversation by apologizing again, this time in front of everyone. My sister, however, wasn't having it. She exploded, accusing me of abandoning her when she needed me most. She said that everything would have been fine if I had just helped them out, if I had been the bigger person. I couldn't hold back any more. I told her that she was delusional for thinking I owed her or Zach anything after the way they had treated me. I reminded her that I had worked for 7 years, giving everything to the company, only to be cast aside for her husband, who turned out to be a criminal. My voice shook with anger, but it felt good to finally say everything I had held in for so long. My father, for once, didn't jump to her defense. Instead, he sat there quietly nodding as if he understood the weight of my words. My sister stormed out, and my mother looked heartbroken, but I knew that I had said what needed to be said. That night I left feeling a strange sense of closure. I didn't know if our family would ever fully heal, but for the first time in years I felt like I had reclaimed my voice. My father had made his peace with me, and I was willing to let him back into my life on my own terms. As for my sister and Zach, I wasn't sure if we'd ever reconcile, and maybe that was for the best. In the end, I realized that sometimes family isn't about forgiveness. Sometimes it's about setting boundaries and protecting yourself. And for the first time, I was okay with that. Update 5. It had been a few months since that tense family dinner, and while things hadn't magically fixed themselves, there was at least some clarity. My father and I had kept in touch. He was trying in his own quiet way to mend our relationship. It was strange to see him so vulnerable, so uncertain. The man who had once seemed unshakable was now navigating life like someone who had lost his bearings. As for me, I'd been focusing on myself. I had thrown myself into work, finding peace in the routines and goals I had set for my own life. I wasn't looking back anymore. My sister and I hadn't spoken since the dinner, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to. There was still too much anger between us, and I needed space to heal. One day, out of the blue, my father called again, but this time there was a sense of urgency in his voice. He wanted to meet for lunch, just the two of us. Something about the way he spoke made me uneasy, but I agreed. When we met, I could tell something was wrong. He looked older, more worn than usual. After some small talk, he finally told me what had been weighing on him. He had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition. It wasn't life-threatening yet, but he needed surgery, and the doctors had warned him that the recovery would be long and difficult. He confessed that the stress of everything, the company, Zach's betrayal, the family's unraveling, had taken a toll on his health. Hearing this stirred a mix of emotions. My father, the man who had put business before everything, was now facing his own mortality. He told me that he wanted to make things right before the surgery. He didn't want to leave anything unsaid, and he asked if I could help him during his recovery. It was a heavy request, and it caught me off guard. For a moment I thought about all the years of pain, the rejection, the anger that had built up between us. But then I realized that despite everything, he was still my father, and maybe this was a chance for me to let go of some of the bitterness that had been weighing me down. I told him that I would help, but only if we did it on my terms. I wasn't going to sacrifice my own well-being to take care of him, but I would be there. He agreed, looking relieved, and for the first time in a long while I felt a sense of understanding between us. A few weeks later, the surgery happened. It went well, but the recovery was tough, just as the doctors had warned. I visited him regularly, helping where I could, but keeping my own boundaries in place. During those visits, We had long conversations, some awkward, others surprisingly honest. He talked about his regrets, about how he had been too focused on building a legacy and not enough on being a father. He admitted that he had always felt like he had to be in control, that showing vulnerability was a sign of weakness. But now, with his health in question and his family fractured, he realized how wrong he had been. It was strange seeing my father like this, but in a way it was healing. I didn't forgive him overnight, but I began to see him not as the infallible figure I had once thought he was, but as a flawed, complex person trying to make amends. During this time my mother had also reached out more. She was still guarded, still caught between her loyalty to my sister and her desire to repair her relationship with me. I could tell that she wanted to fix things, but didn't know how. It was like she was tiptoeing around the issues, hoping they would resolve themselves. I told her that while I appreciated her efforts, she needed to confront the reality of what had happened, especially with my sister. Speaking of my sister, the silence between us remained. I had heard through my mother that she and Zach were going through a nasty divorce. Zach's arrest and legal battles had left her financially and emotionally devastated. Part of me felt for her, but another part of me couldn't forget how she had treated me. I wasn't sure if I wanted to extend an olive branch or keep my distance. One afternoon, though, I received a message from her. It was brief, almost cold. "I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I thought you should know." I didn't know how to respond. Her words felt more like an admission of defeat than a genuine apology, but maybe it was a start. I didn't reply right away. I needed time to think about what I wanted from her, if anything. Life felt like it was in this strange in-between state. There were no dramatic resolutions, no perfect endings. But there was movement. I was rebuilding my life on my terms, setting boundaries with my family and finding peace in the small steps forward. As for my father, he was still recovering both physically and emotionally. The future was uncertain, but for now, I was okay with that. I had finally learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about finding a way to move forward even with all the scars. Final update. It had been a year since my father's surgery, and life had taken on a strange new normal. The once tense and fractured dynamics in my family had started to shift, though nothing had gone back to how it was before, and honestly, I didn't want it to. My father had fully recovered physically, but emotionally he was still working through the aftermath of everything. We weren't as close as some fairy tale reconciliation, but we had come to an understanding. He was no longer the towering figure I had feared for so many years. He was just a man, flawed, trying, and human. We met up for coffee or dinner occasionally, and our conversations were more honest than they had ever been before. He still had regrets about the past, but I could see him making an effort to be present, not just for me, but for himself. He had finally stepped back from the business, letting go of control in ways that would have been unthinkable before. My mother and I were slowly rebuilding too. She had struggled to navigate the distance between my sister and me, but she had stopped trying to fix things and simply accepted the reality of the situation. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was more authentic now. She had learned to respect my boundaries, and I had learned to appreciate that she was trying, even if she didn't always know how to show it. As for my sister, we never really reconciled. After her brief message of apology, there had been no further contact. I heard from my mother that she had moved out of state, starting a new life after her divorce. Part of me wanted to reach out, but a bigger part of me felt that this chapter needed to close. Not every relationship can be saved, and I had come to terms with that. I wasn't angry anymore, just indifferent. Maybe one day we'd find our way back to each other, but for now, I was at peace with the silence. In the end, I had learned something crucial. Family doesn't always mean unconditional love and forgiveness. Sometimes it means setting boundaries, walking away from toxic relationships, and finding your own way. I had spent so much of my life trying to fix things that were broken beyond repair, but now I knew that letting go didn't mean failure, it meant freedom. I had built a life I was proud of, surrounded by people who respected and cared for me. My career was thriving, and I had found peace in the small moments of everyday life. The anger and bitterness I had carried for so long had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. Not everything had to be perfect for me to be happy. As I sat in my apartment looking out at the city lights, I realized something. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had moved forward not by forgetting, but by learning how to live with the scars.